Our first speaker is Bertie Ahern, who was first elected to Dáil Éireann in 1977. Since then, he has held ministerial roles as Minister for Labour, Finance, Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht, as well as Industry and Commerce. He has served as Taoiseach and has held the office of Taoiseach on 3 occasions. His political and negotiation skills were highlighted in April 1998 in the achievement with Tony Blair of the Good Friday Agreement between the British and Irish governments and the political parties of Northern Ireland. Since leaving government in 2008, Bertie Ahern has dedicated his time to conflict resolution and is actively involved with many groups around the world in this context. He has been involved in conflict resolution in the Ukraine and Turkey, with ETA in the Basque Country from 2009 to 2011, and in Papua New Guinea from 2017 to the present time. Bertie Ahern's achievements as a leader, both at home and abroad, have been recognised internationally, illustrated by the fact that he is one of only 5 people to enjoy the great distinction of having been invited to address both Houses of Parliament at Westminster and the Houses of Congress of the United States in Washington, D.C. This morning, Bertie Ahern will speak on how the period 1919 to 1921 shaped the next 100 years in Ireland. Ladies and gentlemen, Bertie Ahern.
Good morning, Regina, and everybody, and delighted to join you and to wish you all well with the day, and congratulate you on the huge amount of work that you've put into organising the summer school. And I do share your view that I hope it goes from strength to strength into the future. If I can, Regina, I'm going to do a little bit of jumping from one place to another as I go through this, because if I just go through the history decade by decade, sometimes I know from doing some of these it can get a bit boring, but just to say from where I come from and where I live, not as beautiful a place as Leitrim, and we don't have the lovely open spaces that is your beautiful county and your beautiful area. And I suppose this weekend we as you're doing, we pay tribute to Sean McDermott. In my own constituency, he's well remembered. Sean McDermott Street goes through the heart of the inner city. Ours McDermott is the offices of the central bus station, as people know it well, and also of the Department of Social Welfare and Family Affairs. And of course, Sean McDermott has spent so much of his time in around the inner city from the time he came to Dublin until his execution. He was involved in Sulcon and Gaeilge and the Gaelic revival, and so many of the Irish nationalism groups that had their centre activity in around the city. I think this period of 1919, 1921, particularly up to the truce up to the December, is a fascinating period in our history, and I commend you for being focusing on that and giving people an opportunity to talk about it. Of course, I've used lockdown to read a huge amount of history books, and I know many others have. So some people are across every bit of detail of this, and I know you have that excellent the group who put the Irish Times supplement together will be on with you later on, and I had the opportunity of participating in that. The area I was brought up in, I say to everybody, in the heart of the city. I'm Drumcondra, just very close to Croke Park. Everybody knows that area. And so many this week, we remember the events that happened just down the road from us here in North Strand, Ballybock, Summerhill, and a little bit further to the Phoenix Park, where we had the bombing, where so many people were killed and injured in that period. And of course, that was in 1941. And just 20 years before that, just a little bit further on down the road, we had the burning of the Custom House. And then, of course, last year, even though we weren't able to commemorate it in the way we wanted to, but Croke Park had the very moving ceremonies around the Bloody Sundays event. And here beside me on Talca Bridge is where 4 Irish volunteers were arrested by the British. And though they didn't injure anyone or kill anyone, they were preparing for an ambush. And Frank Flood and Patrick Doyle, Bernard Ryan and Thomas Bryn were executed a few months afterwards. They were actually caught in a house that's just around the corner from me. And so much of my life has been in areas where all these issues, all these things are commemorated, celebrated, remembered in various ways over the years. And of course, my office on Drumcondra Road, it was opposite that the famous ambush took place on the 11th of October 1920, where Dan Breen was in a shootout where there were 2 British soldiers shot. He was severely injured but got away. And that was only days before Terence McSweeney died. And of course, my father and mother were both Cork. So I was brought up in a house that talked about that non-stop. And then very much beside us here was Kevin Barry in the prison where Kevin Barry was hanged, but it was just down the road in Dorset Street where he was caught outside a pub that's still there today, the Tap pub. So many of these things, I was brought up in an area where these were around me. So if they weren't around me, my father, who was an active volunteer during the War of Independence and served his time in several prisons for his activities, but he always spoke about the Michael ambush and the burning of Cork, and Tom Barry, who we got to know later on because he married a Drumcondra lady, and his brother, her brother, lived on our road. So the opportunity all my life have been with them. So because of all these things, I've been steeped in all of this, and for those reasons, I really say well done to you for keeping the life of Sean McDiarmada alive. I want to say just a few words at this stage about how the political events of the period shaped the future. I want to end up, we have an hour, so I want to end up just talking about some of the issues that are still very clear to everyone's mind around the where I see the future going, where I think we have to still deal with the issues of partition and the ongoing debate about what kind of an Ireland we'll see into the future. But just on the political side of it, I suppose the end of this 1921 is exactly 6 months away now. That's the 6th of December. So there's still 6 months of this period, of the centenary of this period. On the January of 1922, the Dáil ratified the treaty by 64 votes to 57. And of course, that inaugurated the split between the Free State and the pro-treaty Sinn Féin versus the Republican or anti-treaty Sinn Féin. And of course, Republicans didn't want to take the oath of allegiance. So all that period is out in front of us. And of course, the Civil War broke out in 1922. I suppose this time next year, you'll be trying to reflect on that, but a difficult period. But I'm not going to go through the Civil War. It's just the politics of what happened. And of course, if you look at our political system, we've had Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael for the 100 years after this period were the two dominant parties. Things are changing now as we go into the next century. But, you know, if you look what happened, Collins and Griffith initially were the political leaders of the Free State side. And then Griffith died of brain hemorrhage on the 12th of August, 1922. And then Collins is killed in Bale and Blaw in the 22nd of August of 22. And then in the spring of 23, the remaining pro-treaty leaders form a political party called Cumann na Gael. which was Cosgrave, O'Higgins, Mulcahy, Bly, and were among the prominent members. And of course, on the other side of it then, how this period shaped our whole future, the origins of Fianna Fáil, the break with Sinn Féin, the anti-treaty group, retained the name of Sinn Féin, led by De Valera Lamass, and that also involved by late 25, Dev had come to the conclusion that unless his party entered the Dáil, they would become politically irrelevant. And he brought the motion to the Sinn Féin Ardèche in March of 1926, saying that if the oath is removed, Sinn Féin would consider taking their seats in the Dáil. That motion was rejected by the Ardèche. So many hardliners in Sinn Féin were, putting ideology before practicalities, is what Devon Lamass felt, and Sinn Féin was, of course, took an entirely different view. So they went their way. But it was clear to Devon Lamass that Fianna Fáil had to move beyond Civil War politics, even though it was only a few years after. They believed things had to move on. And as we know, it was a slow moving, but they set up the new party that appeals to all traditions to join them. And on the 14th of April 1926, an organising committee for the new party said that they would soon become Fianna Fáil, but strive to bring into one constitutional movement all citizens of goodwill who realise that national peace is necessary to national prosperity, and who were ready to utilise the powers and machinery of government already gained for national advance. And that's a quote from the time. From the beginning, Fianna Fáil was about moving beyond the straitjackets of civil war, and many of the members of Fianna Fáil setting it up were veterans of the Republican side from the Civil War, but they were also joined by others from other political traditions, which is often forgotten. People who had supported the treaty but were disillusioned that the Cosgrave government had not done enough on ending partition, and they also joined Fianna Fáil. Dev's first Minister for Justice on gaining power in 1932 was James Geoghegan. He'd been a member of Cumann Gael throughout the 20s. He was never a TD, and he joined Fianna Fáil at that side. Patrick Lynch, who was Fianna Fáil's Attorney General from 1936 to 1940, had come to the party from the Irish Parliamentary Party tradition, and he had actually unsuccessfully stood against Dev in the East Clare by-election of 1917. And Countess Markovich, of course, who chaired the inaugural meeting of Fianna Fáil, was a founder member, but she was steeped in the Labour trade union tradition. So I suppose the issue of the time that caused all the problems was the oath, which that caused the Civil War. It was redundant from 1927, and of course things went on when O'Higgins was shot dead, and Cosgrave introduced legislation which mandated that a TD not taking his seat forfeits it, and so abstentionism was no longer an option for Fianna Fáil, and they were forced to take the oath and enter the Dáil. On the other side, where things went after the War of Independence, when Dev won power in 1932, he ran a snap election again in January of 33 with a bigger mandate, and Cumann Gael at that stage realised that they're in electoral trouble, as do some of the smaller parties. So in September of 1933, Fine Gael is born. And of course, sometimes people think Fine Gael was just moving Cumann Gael to Fine Gael, but that wasn't the case. It's a merger of Cumann Gael, the National Centre Party, the Army Comrades Association, and elements of the National League. Again, this is a watering down of Civil War baggage, and the National Centre Party, led by Frank McDermott and James Dillon, the son of John Dillon, a close ally of Redmond, is national of Redmond. And the National Centre Party was made up of old home rulers and farmers and former independents. The Army Comrades Association, of course, was a quasi-military, they wore a quasi-military uniform, and They were led by Owen McDuffie, who saw himself as a bit of an Irish Mussolini. The National League were old Redmondites and Home Rulers, and people from a Southern Unionist background also threw in their lot with Fine Gael, including the Dockrell dynasty, who were a strong group at that time. So they were, then the issues moved on. I suppose as time moves on, the Fine Gael crossed the Civil War Rubicon when it goes into government with arch Republicans of Clonach Poblacht, who had strong IRA links, and the leader Sean McBride was an ex-IRA chief of staff, and McBride would not accept Fine Gael's leader Mulcahy as Taoiseach due to Mulcahy's role in the Civil War execution, and Costello became a compromised Taoiseach. So, and all of that period moved on, and I suppose then in later years, Alan Dukes had the Tallaght strategy, where he worked with Charlie Haughey. Then we had the Democratic Left with John Bruden going in with Democratic Left, who were from Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party originally. Then Fianna Fáil moved into a coalition governments, which was an issue that they never wanted to do. And then Fianna Fáil were with Labour, and then with the Progressive Democrats. So things have evolved. So it brings us where we are now, with three parties in coalition and the two Civil War parties together. So politically, things advance. And when you look back, I think there was far more movements and change than people actually believe. Just going back, if I can, because I know this is a question I've been asked on many issues on schools during the winter in this 1920-21 period. But in that 1919-21 period, between the British forces, the Republicans, there were over 1,400 people killed in that short period. 363 police personnel, 261 British Army, 550 IRA volunteers, and around 200 civilians. And of course, in Northern Ireland, there was about 557 people died in political violence. But some of those died in that period after the 11th of July, 1921. So because the violence continued throughout that period. I just want to go back now, just particularly on that period, that really difficult period in our history of 1920 and 21, because I think it is important that we talk a bit about it, and then later I'll just come right back up to current times. But since the 1870s, Irish nationalists in the Irish Parliamentary Party had been demanding home rule or self-government from Britain, and organisations as those led by Arthur Griffin, Sinn Féin, argued for some form of Irish independence. And at that stage, they were probably in a small minority, but the demand for home rule was eventually granted by the British government in 1912, but that prompted immediately a prolonged crisis within the United Kingdom, as Ulster Unionists formed an armed organisation, the Ulster Volunteers, to insist this measure of devolution, at least in territory, they could control. And of course, the nationalists then formed their organisation, the Irish Volunteers. So all of these periods that led to these difficulties emanate from that period. The British Parliament did pass the Government of Ireland Act in 1914, known as the Home Rule Act, on the 18th of September 1914, with an unending bill for the partition of Ireland. It was introduced by Ulster Unionist MPs, but the Act's implementation was postponed immediately by the Suspensory Act of 1914 due to the outbreak of the World War. So the majority of nationalists followed their parliamentary leaders, John Redmond's call to support Britain and the Allied war effort in Irish regiments of the new British Army. and the intention being to ensure the commencement of Home Rule after the war. But there was a significant majority of volunteers who opposed our involvement in the war, and the volunteer movement split, a majority leaving to form the National Volunteers under Redmond, and the remaining Irish Volunteers under Owen McNeill. I'm sure Mike McDougall will be talking about that period very dear to his own family. Then, of course, we had the Easter Rising. No need to go through that. We've talked a lot about that over the last number of years. And then we went into the period of the first Dáil in April 1918. The British cabinet, in the face of the crisis caused by the German spring offences, attempted with a dual policy to simultaneously link the enactment of conscription into Ireland with the implementation of Home Rule, as outlined in the report of the Irish Constitution of April 1918. That further alienated Irish nationalists, and of course there were the huge demonstrations during the conscription crisis of 1918. And in that general election, as we all know, Irish voters showed their disapproval to the policy of the British government by giving Sinn Féin 70% or 73 seats out of 105 of the Irish seats. And of course, at Waterdows were 25 and were not contested at all. Sinn Féin won 91% of the seats outside of Ulster, and 47% of the votes cast in what was a minority in Ulster, where Unionists were a majority. So that was that period of the first Dáil. And then, I suppose, without going through that 1918, 1919 period, because I want to kind of cover the later period that we're talking about today. But while it was not clear at the beginning of 1919 that the Dáil ever intended to gain independence by military means, the war was, I think, not explicitly threatened in Sinn Féin's 1918 manifesto. An incident occurred in, of course, which we've heard a lot about recently, back in January 1919, the same day as the first Dáil convened, and the solid red bag ambush in Tipperary, led by Sean Tracy and Sean Hogan and Dan Breen, Seamus Robinson, acting on their own initiative. They attacked RUC officers, and that is now in our history, even though it was an unofficial action. It is widely regarded as the beginning of this period that we're talking about this morning, the War of Independence. The British government declared South Tipperary a special military area under the defence of the Realm Act, and 2 days later, so the war was not formally declared by the Dáil, but it ran its course parallel to the Dáil's political life. So that really is where this period all started. And after the First World War in 1919, the powers in Europe at that stage sat down to redraw the boundaries of Europe, and Sinn Féin put in their submissions and to those meetings and attempted to have Ireland included in the redrawing, but they argued that Ireland should be granted independence through the treaty. However, the leaders in Europe largely ignored that, and they returned no progress for Sinn Féin. With the third Home Rule bill under discussion at that stage for several years, with no implementation, I think the volunteers decided that they had waited long enough and that they would have to take action to increase the pace. And they also hoped that by becoming a formidable military force, they could persuade the governments to introduce a complete independence rather than the Home Rule solution. In 1919, they renamed themselves the Irish Republican Army, which really signaled the start of a new phase in their history. So, as I said, in the 21st of January 1919, the IRA were involved in that event in Tipperary in 1920. The IRA, led by Michael Collins, concluded that the war was not having the desired effect and decided to intensify it. And of course, he did that on the 21st November 1920, when they shot 11 British agents. And of course, we all know the story of what happened in the afternoon in Croke Park. And meanwhile, despite the conflict, the government decided to press ahead with the Home Rule and passed the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. And this gave Ireland 2 parliaments, each with a prime minister, one unionist and one nationalist. Incidentally, I should mention that it was this weekend, 100 years ago, that the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland appointed James Craig as the first prime minister in Northern Ireland. So your event coincides with that. I think that was the 7th of June of 1921. I think the elections that took place then in after that period, the elections were held for the Nationalist Parliament in Dublin in May 21. Sinn Féin under De Valera again took a huge part of the seats, 124, with the remaining 4 going to Unionist candidates. However, Sinn Féin refused to recognise the Parliament and instead continued to meet in Dáil Éireann, which was their own Parliament. The 4 Unionists were the only ones who attended the new Parliament. The IRA under Collins, of course, continued to fight, and that all went on all the way up until the 11th of June 1921. So we're getting near to that period of the end of the violence. But right through 1920, right through 20 and 21, there was so much. The IRA's main target during so much of the period, I was reading back some good books on this during lockdown, was mainly the Royal Irish Constabulary, and that still creates quite a lot of friction here in my neighbouring area of Glasnevin, and the various memorials. But there is an enormous amount of the Royal Irish Constabulary buried in Glasnevin, along with so many others of our important political people of the time. In April 1920, there was 400 abandoned RIC barracks. They were burned to the ground by the IRA to prevent them ever being used again, along with almost 100 income tax offices. Of course, the tactic was to try and break British administration, particularly outside of Dublin. The RIC withdrew from much of the countryside, leaving in the hands of the IRA. And in that June-July period, right across the south and west of Ireland, trials by jury could not be held because jurors could not attend. And so the collapse of the court system, of course, had a huge effect on how British were able to deal with the ongoing troubles. The British forces, of course, in trying to reassert their control over the country, often resorted to arbitrary reprisals against Republican activists and the civilian population. An unofficial government policy of reprisals began back in Fermoy in County Cork, and that went on for some time in what were some of the fiercest battles of that particular time. Many of them that my father, I was the youngest in the family, my father would be 120 if he was alive now, that he was involved in right across Cork during his active years. Again, those who were very familiar with the period know all these things inside out, but as I found out, many people don't. But Michael Collins was the driving force behind the independence movement, and nominally he was the Minister for Finance in the Republic's government, and he was IRA Director of Intelligence. He was involved in providing funds and arms to the IRA units and in the selection of officers, and his charisma and capability galvanized many that he came in contact with, and he certainly operated a very well organized and dedicated system. The Chief of Staff, of course, was Richard Mackay, who was responsible for directing the IRA units around the country, and both Collins and Mulcahy were responsible in theory to Cathal Brugha for the activities, but I think Brugha had only a supervisory role, recommending or objecting to various actions. A great deal also depended on the IRA leaders in local areas. Liam Lynch, well remembered in Cork, of course, Tom Barry, the father's hero, and Sean Moylan and Sean McCone and Ernie O'Malley, who organised the guerrillas activity. I was trying to research in some from records in Cork. I was involved in the programme of my dad with Who Do You Think You Are programme, but I always had the view that the Irish Volunteers had something like 110,000 men. In fact, I think when you look at the records, they probably had about 15,000 that were active during the course of the war. But at any one time, and that the War of Independence, so from what I could see, there was probably plus or minus 3,000 members. So it'd be interesting to hear what the real figure is. But from my records in Cork, where a huge amount of the fighting went, it certainly wasn't 15,000. So I think some of the folklore perhaps is not. There obviously were people in safe houses and people who were assisting, but I think in clear numbers of any one time who were actually engaged in the War of Independence, it was probably smaller. Of course, the escalation of the war was a number of events dramatically escalated the conflict towards the end of 1920. The Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence McSweeney, as I mentioned, died in Brixton, while other IRA prisoners were in hunger strike as well, and died in Cork jails. Then there was the Bloody Sunday event, which is well remembered. I don't need to say anything about that, because I know that young people even have a good take on that. Michael Hogan and all that is remembered about him. At the peak of the violence was around that Christmas period of 1920, right up to exactly this time, 100 years ago, during those 8 months until the truce, which is just a month off now. There was a spiraling death toll. There were about 1,000 people at that period being killed in those 5 or 6 months from Christmas up until the last week or the first week in July, and that represented nearly 3/4 of the total casualty for the entire 3 years of the conflict. So it was exactly this time 100 years ago that we really saw the huge amount of violence. And of course, there are all of those famous ones between the 1st of November 1920 and the June of 1921, right to this weekend. 24 men were executed by the British, Kevin Barry being the first. And as some people would recall, I was involved for over 20 years in the Forgotten 10. That was big. I got involved because of the 4 people who were killed in my own neighbourhood. But Sean O'Callaghan, the famous RTE GAA reporter, who had family connections, had been involved with me for a 20-year period, trying to get negotiations to take the bodies from the Mount Joy and bring them to Glasnevin. We managed to do in 2001, 20 years ago, and that took a long time of agreement with the families and all of the other negotiations, and it was a was a great day to be able to have a state funeral for those when I was at Taoiseach and see the end of a 20-year period. And I should mention Sean Sherwin, who at that time worked very closely with me, National Graves Associations and other groups. I'm not going to cover the period of July on, because I think probably the truce period, the War of Independence in Ireland ended with a truce, as we know, on the 11th of July, 1921, almost 100 years ago. And the conflict had reached a stalemate. The deaths were the number of people being killed, the fact the British Army were now executing people. Trials were becoming rare enough. If I look at the 4 people in my own neighbourhood that were killed at that time and executed, there was roughly, from the time they were caught until the time they were executed, was about 2.5 months. And even though they hadn't injured anyone or killed anyone, they were still hung in Mountjoy Jail, and that was what was happening in the numbers that I mentioned earlier on. So I think it was the conflict had reached that kind of a stalemate. Talks had looked promising the year earlier, but that they had more or less ended in getting nowhere, because David Lloyd George insisted the IRA first surrender their arms. That was an issue that I had to deal with later on the decommissioning issue, 80 years later. So some things never change. And fresh talks after the Prime Minister had come under pressure from Asquith and the Liberal opposition, the Labour Party and the Trade Unions Congress resumed in the spring and resulted in the truce. And from the point of view of the British government, it appeared that if the IRA's guerrilla campaign would continue indefinitely, with spurring costs in British casualties and money. And so I think, at that stage, the British had tens of thousands. I mean, they if you add up all the people that were involved between the soldiers and auxiliaries and TANs, and like the cost to the British Exchequer was huge. Just from a historic perspective, the initial breakthrough that led to the truce is credited in most history books to King George V, the Prime Minister of South Africa, General John Smuts, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Lloyd George. The King had made, it's well recorded, his unhappiness in the behaviour of the TANs, Black and TANs, and he when he was opening up the Parliament in Northern Ireland, which was considered to be a really good speech, which was created as a result of partition, he made an appeal for conciliation and for an end of the troubles. And he asked, the King asked to draft his ideas on paper, and Smuts prepared this draft and gave copies to the King and to Lloyd George. And then invited Smuts was to the cabinet to try and deal with these issues. So that speech was delivered in Belfast on the 22nd of June of 1921, and was universally well received. And to this day, it was considered to be a speech. It called for all Irish men to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and to forget, and to join in making for the land they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill. It would have been nice if it had been followed and implemented as the King put it forward. But it was a good speech, and I've no doubt that if you take it, that within a few weeks there was a truce, and that moved things on. It's 11 now, so I just wanted to turn. I think I'm with you till about 20 past or half past for the questions. I just want to turn to more recent times and just give you my view on the last 25 years. We've covered how the political issues worked and how things, the involvement of the political parties, and we've talked about the period itself, from 1870 and then up to what was 1918, 1921, the period that is there. But of course, the issues of partition and the problems of partition have continued. Eamon de Valera, as leader of Fianna Fáil, was fond of using the phrase "the evil of partition" in his speeches, and I was reared in a household that was vehemently opposed to partitions. My father would have been a hardliner on these issues, and always believed that we had to continue to move and to work towards the unification of the country. That was his view, though he understood that had to be done by negotiation, and because he had spent most of his life trying to do it otherwise. But I think if you take the last 25 years, I think it's widely recognised that few agreements entered into by the state have gained quite the same level of international recognition, support, or had the same positive transformative effect as the Good Friday Agreement. I would have thought, having been so deeply involved in it, and spent 9 years of my life trying to get the implementation of it, to get the executive up in May 2007, that maybe it would have faded. But in the last 5 or 6 years, Brexit has brought it into the forefront of EU and world politics. But I just want to go through this period and where we have to go for the future, in my view. What the agreement did was it opened the door to the ending of one form of division in Ireland, which had a long and often very dark history, with roots that ran much further back than the foundation of the state itself. And what the agreement heralded more immediately was the prospect of ending the violence in which the intercommunal divisions of the past all too often found expression, particularly through, though not exclusively, during the closing decades of the last century. And the violence has now all but ended, and there is, we know, a small minority who seem always bent on returning to the slaughter and destruction of the past, but all in the name of securing objectives which, as our history has clearly demonstrated, can only be achieved and maintained by political means. The ongoing determination of the authorities north and south to apply the security arrangements necessary to thwart the efforts of this minority is clear. It manifestly deserves the support of all right-thinking people. And removing of the threat and reality of violence has for most people been the major achievement of the agreement. But the agreement, of course, sought to do more than that. What is aimed to do fundamentally was to put in place a set of political and other arrangements which, if implemented, would enable two communities long divided to live in peace and harmony with one another in a shared territorial space. And this, as everybody knows, and as all of us, I think, knew at the time, was never going to be an easy task. And there are divisions in all societies, which often questionably, perhaps many of us would categorize as peaceful societies. The societal conditions that are created, for example, by issues such as inequality of opportunity, by racial and other forms of discrimination, are features of many societies that are nevertheless judged to be peaceful societies. So attempting to address such differences is part of the main concern of normal political action. In the case of Northern Ireland, there is an additional source of deep-rooted division, which has its origins in what are described as inherited allegiances. Put very briefly, one half of Northern Ireland sees itself as British, its members having inherited allegiance to Britain. They will readily recognise their Irishness in the sense that they were born on the island of Ireland, but they will hasten to point out to the fact that the island on which they were born, Northern Ireland, is in law part of the United Kingdom. So as far as they're concerned, Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK. The other half of the society see itself as Irish, its members having an inherited allegiance to Ireland. The fact that they've been born in Northern Ireland does not make them British, because Ireland's north and south should be united and should be governed from Dublin and not from London. And at the heart of the intercommunal division and violence which emerged on and off throughout much of the 20th century we're talking about today was the fact that those who took the latter position found themselves victims of discrimination in areas such as housing and work opportunities and so on. And that discrimination was largely overlooked and some would say tolerated or indeed supported by the British government. Peaceful protests aimed at ending marginalisation and discrimination was suppressed, and in some cases very violently suppressed now almost 50 years ago, which opened the way for those who believed that violence was the only way forward to enter the fray with the disaster consequences that followed the decades afterwards. So we went from 50 years back right up till the Good Friday Agreement, now not far off a quarter of a century, 23 years plus. The Good Friday Agreement, as I indicated, was an attempt to put in place a new paradigm which would ensure the difference would be accommodated safely and securely in Northern Ireland. And the agreement did not seek to suppress or override traditional allegiance or aspirations on either side of the divide, but it did provide various supports and awareness that this would not happen. There is, for example, the very powerful assurance which was provided by the formal acknowledgement and agreement on the principle of consent, that changes to the Irish Constitution were agreed, they've been implemented, a change which presented real difficulty for nationalists and Republicans. It wasn't easy for any of us. And new governance structures were agreed, which would address the political imbalance which prevailed for years in Northern Ireland. And the functioning of these institutions, the Assembly, the Executive, have experienced periods of significant turbulence, as we all know. And of course, there were all the other issues that I don't want to go into about policing and all the other things. But Northern Ireland has been transformed, and it's a safer place now to work, to visit, to relax, to do business. This weekend, all the hotels in the north are full of people from the south because everything is opened up there. However, more is required and more has and will continue to be demanded in terms of implementing the Good Friday Agreement, including what is perhaps the most challenging element of the agreement. There is no escaping the fact the agreement put in place a mechanism whereby those whose aspiration is to see United Ireland can see that aspiration become a reality. The agreement went beyond recognising that it is legitimate to aspire to a United Ireland. It specifies the route through which the aspirations become a reality. And there's no doubt that without that specific element, without the roadmap, no agreement would have been forthcoming in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Now, all these years later, I think it is time to consider that this parted agreement and how we do while respecting the allegiance and aspirations on both sides of the community. The agreement provides that it is for the people of the island of Ireland alone by agreement between the two parts respectively and without external impediment to exercise the right of self-determination on the basis of comment freely and concurrently given North and South to bring about United Ireland, if that is their wish, accepting that this right must be achieved with and subject to the agreement and consent of the people of Northern Ireland. It goes on to provide that Northern Ireland will not cease to be part of the UK without the consent of a majority of the people in Northern Ireland, voting the poll held for the purposes of establishing the majority view. And the agreement further provides that it is a matter for the Secretary of State to call that. But a core feature of these provisions is that the obligation to hold a poll arises when it appears to the Secretary of State that the conditions mentioned are satisfied. And a central question, which I want to end with you today, to be addressed in all of this, is what exactly is meant by United Ireland. It would be impossible for the Secretary of State, or anyone else for that matter, to form a view as to whether a majority of the people in Northern Ireland would be likely to support the idea of Northern Ireland being part of United Ireland if there wasn't clarity as to what being part of United Ireland actually meant and what people thought they were voting for. A poll, North and South, would make no sense without clarity as to what such a very, very profound jurisdictional change would mean in practice. It would be necessary at a minimum, in my view, that the electorate north and south would have an agreed understanding on, for example, matters such as what governance structures and electoral arrangements would apply thereafter on the island of Ireland, i.e. in the new Ireland. What would be the new East-West relations look like? What vestiges, if any, would remain of the existing Northern Ireland-UK relationship, either long-term or during a translated phase? What would be the cost implications be? And in the event of what polls favoured change, how would these costs be met? What the change would mean for people north and south in terms of, for example, of welfare, health and education position? What changes would be required as regards legal regimes, security arrangements, policing and immigration services? What provisions would be needed to put in place to ensure that the new minority on the island of Ireland would be quite likely represent a high proportion of the unionist community? So all of these issues, and there are many more, and I'll leave you with this, there are many more than those I've just mentioned, need to be addressed sooner rather than later. And there's a need to put forms of engagement in place to ensure that they are tested and teased out openly, objectively, and comprehensively. There are issues that need to be the subject of public debate, clarity, and agreement before any poll is conducted. And the matters arising are too serious for us to proceed with a poll carrying potential or far-reaching consequences while taking the cavalier view of that, to borrow a phrase, everything will be all right in the night. So the Brexit fiasco has given us all, I think, the clear view that the dangers of asking the electorate to take a view on matters of great political import with no real clarity as to the implications of voting. So for the avoidance of any doubt, Regina, as I conclude on the matter, the suggestions that we need to flesh out and have agreement on what is meant by United Ireland before there can be any meaningful poll is not a recipe for kicking the can down the road on the question of the poll. The proposition is rather that unless we undertake the substantial task of analysis and consensus, just as I have pointed out, we'll never get to the point where an informed opinion can be reached as to whether a meaningful poll would be held. A failure to undertake the preparatory work provides, I think, perhaps the best possible governance that the issue of the poll will remain indefinitely, or whether it can be kicked down the road. So, Regina, I think we still have a quarter of an hour for questions. And again, thanks for giving me the opportunity of going through, even if a bit fast, 100 years.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Bertie. And yes, indeed, we have some time for questions. And I've got some in here at the moment. The first one that came in earlier on was, you mentioned that the oath was obsolete in 1926. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this, please?
Well, I think after, the changes that were brought forward, I think De Valera knew that if you're going to win your seat in Parliament, you're going to be out. You couldn't hold your seat unless you took your seat. You were going to be replaced. And then I think the decision clearly, Republicans didn't want to take an oath of allegiance, and they had to ultimately take their seat and take a different position. But I think the view of Dev and others were tactically they have to stay in Parliament, and they wanted to stay in the Dáil. They wanted to form a new political movement.
Okay. Another question that has come in from attendee in the UK is, she says that the current debate on a United Ireland is so far out of the correct timing, out of the correct time frame. And she states that the Good Friday Agreement is far from complete. She asks for your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think nothing ever stays the same. And in the Good Friday Agreement, there is, of course, a review clause. We used that already once in the St. Andrews Agreement. And then there's the subsequent agreement like the Stormont House Agreement and other works that have taken place. But what the Good Friday Agreement does clearly, but it sets out that the aspiration for United Ireland is still there. The point that I was making in the latter half of my contribution is that I'm totally a supporter of United Ireland. But what we haven't done, even though we've been talking about partition for the last 100 years in this country, the reality is, as we talk here this morning at the Sean McDermott Summer School, the necessary analysis and detailed work of how it would all be put together so that you can put it to the public in a meaningful way has not been done. Now, there are some academic studies going on now, which I think are very good. There was just a report came out this week from London University. So there is work as underway, and I know that there are a number of groups have doing it. But as of now, we haven't done that work. And it's not just about the cost of it. There's all, how would you amalgamate Garda Síochána with the PSNI? How would the judicial system operate? How would departments integrate? So where are the guarantees for the unionists and the loyalist people that they wouldn't be treated the same as the nationalist people were by them in 100 years ago? So all of these issues need to be teased out, and there's a huge job of work to be done so that the questions can be put to the people. So, but we should not forget, but that the basis of the Good Friday Agreement was that the principle of consent, but there will on another day be an opportunity for people to vote on United Ireland. But we have to work out what that means, and we haven't done that in this country yet.
Okay, and another question that's coming in here is, where do you see unionism heading in the next few years?
I think what will happen, Regina, is that unionism, they're going through let's say a strange time at the moment, a challenging time for them. But I do think you will see emerge sooner rather than later, unionist people articulating in a coherent way why the people of Northern Ireland should stay with the United Kingdom. They haven't been really making that case either good, but I do, from what I know, they are beginning to work. So the case would be put by nationalist Republicans on one side, but I think you will see a bit like happened in Scotland when Gordon Brown and the others put the other side of the question. And I think you will see that emerging. And my own sense is that there are people working already to make that happen. So you're going to see a far more united unionist message than appears at the moment.
Okay, so next question, Bertie, moves back to the War of Independence, actually. What would you consider was possibly the most significant effect or impact on Irish society of the War of Independence? What had the longest lasting impact on Irish society, in your opinion, and why?
Well, I suppose, the War of Independence, it gave a whole sense of the leadership here, the political leadership had to kind of start working out where they saw things for the future. I don't think I think the issue of partition was kind of already happening. So I don't think it was the War of Independence really was the cause of that. But unfortunately, the vision that it was setting out to do in the War of Independence was probably never going to get full Irish freedom, which is what they had hoped, building on the 1916 proclamation. But it did set out that it was possible to have an Irish sovereign state. Unfortunately, I think the vision of Collins and most of the others, De Valera, was that was going to be 32 counties. They didn't get that. They ended up with 26. And they ended up with what they thought was going to be another stepping stone with the Boundary Commission. And it'll be a few years more before you can be talking, Regina, about the Boundary Commission 1926. But unfortunately, I think the Boundary Commission was one of the real tragedies, because if Collins had been alive and Griffiths, and if there hadn't been a civil war immediately after it, I think there would have been successes out of the Boundary Commission. But unfortunately, I think when they signed the treaty, let's leave aside all the differences that led to the Civil War, but I really believe that they felt that this was a major issue, which was only a few years away, and that this was going to really make a difference. And of course, it didn't. In fact, there's argument even about what was in that draft report of the Boundary Commission. But I think they did achieve a lot. And if there had been a Boundary Commission, maybe they would have achieved a great deal more. But they did prove that you could set up an independent state, and even if it became a free state rather than what they wanted was a 32 county.
Okay, Bertie, I'm going just to take one final question before we conclude, and it is this: how can a new united Ireland be designed when the unionist politicians simply repeat the mantra "Ulster says no" and refuse to engage in any meaningful way? How can this effective veto be addressed?
Yeah, well, here's the challenge. I mean, we're not going to. The principle of consent is the basis of the Good Friday Agreement, and it's the basis that we can try to negotiate this in a peaceful way. So the challenge is for those of us that want a united Ireland, that want to be not only friends with our unionists and loyalist communities, but want them to join and be part of us. We must persuade them. We must persuade them of the benefits, the advantages, the protections, the safeguards of that. And that is the challenge on Republicans and nationalists and the people of the South and the people of the North who have a different view. But it must be done by the powers of persuasion. The questioner is correct that they will not engage. And the reason they won't engage is because how they see it is that once they engage, that they're accepting the inevitability. That's how they see it. I'm not saying this is how I'd see it, but it's how they see it. I've talked to many senior loyalists and Republicans on this. They know that it's an issue, but they feel if they get into the tent and start discussing it, then they've weakened their position. And that's why I believe, in the reply to the earlier question, that they're going to start articulating why they should stay with the United Kingdom. So I think it is for us to make the case, as the Scottish Nationalist Party are doing peacefully in Scotland, and as Plaid Cymru are beginning to do more successfully than they ever did in Wales. So that's the challenge for us, and it's the one that we need to take on, rather than moaning about unionism and moaning about, we have to convince those people who vote for them.
Thank you very much, Bertie, for answering all of those questions. Thank you very much for taking part in our summer school. Thank you for your presentation, and we will take this morning's session to a close now.